Arizona's landscape is unforgiving. The sun here is intense, baking Gilbert, Arizona nearly 330 days a year, with average annual highs just shy of 90 degrees Fahrenheit. During the summer months, temperatures can surge close to 120 degrees, making Arizona's heat harsh and relentless. To survive in this environment, both animals and people have to find ways to stay cool and conserve water. With rainfall occurring only around 30 days each year, life in the Sonoran Desert depends heavily on careful water management. Building a zoo in this climate demands careful attention to detail, from shade placement to water conservation. If Gilbert Zoo is going to thrive in the desert, every decision matters. I'm trying to build a realistic zoo set in Gilbert, Arizona in Planet Zoo. Previously, we built habitats for the coyote, the javelina, and the African spurred tortoise. And now, for the first time, the zoo is officially profitable and completely debt-free. That gives us the opportunity to start improving the Great State 48 Trail and continue shaping Gilbert Zoo into something truly special. Welcome back to Gilbert Zoo. Starting off today's episode, here's what Gilbert Zoo currently looks like. And here's a look at our current map. There are still quite a few eyesores around the zoo that desperately need my attention, and one of the first things I want to tackle is the entrance. Right now, the guest spawners feel a little too close to the front gate, and I wanted entering the zoo to feel more like an experience instead of guests immediately spilling into the park. To avoid breaking everything, I placed a temporary guest spawner connected to more permanent pathing before deleting the original entrance layout and repositioning the guest spawners entirely. Next to the entrance, I wanted to create a natural-looking wash, which is essentially a dry riverbed inspired by Arizona's natural washes and stormwater management systems. I spent a lot of time shaping the wash and placed the guest path parallel to it, which helps the entrance feel like it was designed around the landscape rather than placed on top of it. A little fun fact for you guys: Gilbert, Arizona sits in the Sonoran Desert and is known for being extremely flat, with only minimal rolling hills throughout the area. But I'm gonna take advantage of the fact that there has to be at least one hill somewhere within Gilbert city limits, right? While Gilbert has very few naturally occurring hills, artificial berms and man-made elevation changes are surprisingly common throughout the area. And the reason behind them reveals something important about how cities across Arizona manage water in the desert. Although rainfall in the Sonoran Desert is relatively rare, heavy storms can quickly become dangerous. The desert ground is extremely dry and compact, making it difficult for water to absorb. Instead of quickly soaking into the earth, rainwater can rush across the surface, creating powerful flash floods. Because of this, Arizona cities rely on carefully engineered landscaping to help slow, redirect, and temporarily store stormwater. Retention basins, dry riverbeds, artificial berms, and gradual elevation changes all work together to guide water away from roads and neighborhoods while giving it time to naturally absorb back into the ground. Even many parks and green spaces throughout the valley are designed with flood control in mind. What may look like decorated hills or uneven desert landscaping often serves as a much more practical purpose. Rocks help reduce erosion, basins collect runoff, and sculpted terrain helps control how water moves throughout the environment. So now that the zoo is stable financially, it's time to start shaping the terrain more intentionally by adding elevation changes and designing realistic runoff paths throughout the landscape. Let's take a step back and see how things are looking so far. I'm a little nervous with this build because if the wash isn't done carefully, it could easily look awkward or unnatural. But so far, I'm really happy with where this is headed, and I feel like the entrance is starting to take shape. As I started placing the rock work, I wanted the wash to feel like it had been shaped by water over time. In the desert, washes may sit dry for most of the year, but during heavy storms, they can suddenly carry fast-moving runoff through the landscape. That's why the rocks in the wash aren't just decorative. Larger stones help suggest erosion control, while smaller gravel and sediment collect along the bottom where water would naturally settle and slow down. A lot of the inspiration for this area actually came from one of my favorite places in Arizona, the Queen Creek Wash. I'm always surprised by how beautiful the wash is, and I love seeing local wildlife there, including coyotes, roadrunners, and even great horned owls. The Queen Creek Wash stretches for miles, creating a rugged kind of desert beauty that I'm really hoping to emulate here at Gilbert Zoo. I strategically placed larger rocks in natural-looking clusters, then surrounded them with smaller stones to help make the area feel more weathered and realistic. After that, I traced around the rock piles with the coarse sand terrain brush to add another layer of texture and detail. Planet Zoo doesn't really have a perfect gravel option, and even the smallest rock pieces are still fairly large. But by sinking some of those rocks into the ground, I can make them appear much smaller than they actually are, which is really helping create the look I'm going for. The idea is that flowing water would carry smaller particles through the wash, while larger rocks and boulders would resist erosion. Over time, those large rocks would create natural pockets where sand, gravel, and debris would collect. After placing the rocks, I manually added foliage around the wash. Realistically, the basin itself would be very sparse, but as you move up the bank, the plant life would gradually become fuller. I started with trees and large cacti, placing them sparingly around the upper edges, then added medium-sized bushes and shrubs along the middle of the bank. This really sold the effect I was going for, and I'm very pleased with how it turned out. Next up, I needed to create a safe way for guests to cross the wash. I knew that if the walkway dipped down into the channel, it could become flooded during heavy storms. Instead, I decided to build a short bridge over the wash, allowing guests to cross safely while still leaving room for storm water to pass underneath. I started with the European rustic stone wall panel and traced it along the border of the walkway. Because the path is slightly rounded, each section had to be manually rotated until the curve looked natural. My idea was to create a rustic stone bridge with plaster accents and a simple railing above it. For the railing, I used the European marquee beams, string pieces, a lot of hinges, and the Twilight portcullis metal bracing. The most difficult part of this mini build was getting everything aligned correctly. With so many small pieces working together, even tiny placement issues became noticeable. But once everything was lined up, it felt like the bridge really started looking professional. After I was happy with the overall shape, I repainted the rustic stones to better match the surrounding desert landscape. Then I darkened the metal pieces so they paired better with the black string railing. I really loved the extra texture the Twilight portcullis metal bracing adds. It makes the bridge feel slightly worn down, which is a subtle but really nice detail. With the bridge complete, guests now have a safe way to enter and exit the zoo, even if the wash were to flood during a heavy storm. Gosh, I'm really happy with how the wash and the bridge turned out. I'm relieved that they don't look awkward or out of place. The bridge gives guests a much stronger entrance moment as they cross over the wash, and honestly, I think this area looks absolutely beautiful. The entrance still needs some work, but it's starting to look much more realistic and much more complete. So for now, I'm ready to move on to the next build. At this point, when guests enter the zoo, one of the first things they see is a big stretch of empty real estate, and we definitely need to change that. The next habitat we're going to build is for the African penguin, and it's going right next to the African spurred tortoise habitat near the entrance. These boxes represent roughly the size and location of the habitat. The larger box marks the penguin habitat, and the smaller box is where I'm planning to build a splash pad for our guests. Splash pads are really common in Arizona and are a great way to help families cool off, especially during the brutal summer months, but more on that later. I was really excited to build for the African penguins, and honestly, I got carried away a little bit with their habitat. Originally, I planned on giving them an indoor shelter with access to an outdoor pool. Planet Zoo Zoopedia says African penguins can tolerate temperatures up to 109 degrees Fahrenheit, so at first I assumed they would realistically be fine with a cooled outdoor pool, some fans, misters, and plenty of shade. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized that a realistic African penguin habitat in Gilbert, Arizona would need to be much more climate controlled. According to AZA Penguin Care Guidance, African penguins do best with carefully managed air and water temperatures, along with access to heat relief and climate-controlled areas when outdoor temperatures rise. And while African penguins can handle warmer conditions than some other penguin species, Arizona's summer heat is on a completely different level. With temperatures pushing close to 120 degrees, an exposed outdoor habitat could jeopardize these endangered birds. So, I decided to scrap the outdoor habitat and restart the plan with a fully indoor air-conditioned penguin exhibit. Admittedly, I tried to see if there was a way to pivot to a different animal instead of deleting everything I had already created. But honestly, the build you've been seeing had so many micro imperfections that would have bothered me every time I looked at it. In other words, starting from scratch was the right call, and I think you'll agree that the final build ends up being a lot better than this rough draft. I started by carving out the pool, and I wanted to make sure the guest viewing was just right. It's incredible seeing penguins seemingly fly through the water, so I wanted guests to have that experience by placing the water level at the right height in the tank. The build design limited guests to one viewing area, so it was important for that one viewing area to have a variety of angles. To make that work, I used this archer as a marker, which made it easier to figure out exactly where the path needed to be. With the path placed here, guests would be able to see the penguins swimming underwater while still getting a good view of them navigating the rockwork in shallower areas. I've mentioned this before, but I'm definitely not an architect, and building in Planet Zoo has a pretty steep learning curve. That said, the series has really helped my confidence. I'm so thankful for all the kind words and constructive feedback I've received so far, because it has really helped me feel more confident as I try to build the best and most realistic zoo I can. You guys have been incredibly kind and supportive, so thank you for commenting on my previous videos. And speaking of realism, it's also important to give African penguins varied flooring. Consistent concrete flooring can contribute to foot problems in penguin species, including bumblefoot, so keeping plain concrete to a minimum is really important. With that in mind, I intentionally placed rockwork to emulate different islands, then placed enrichment items to encourage the penguins to swim between them. My hope is that this maximizes guest viewing while also giving the penguins plenty of enrichment and space to move around. Speaking of space, the stage area for the penguins is a bit compact, so it took some time figuring out how to make everything fit together nicely. And something that helped me to visualize that was creating piping that connected the water treatment equipment to the penguin pool. This is a completely unnecessary detail in Planet Zoo, and the piping ends up being covered by a wall so it isn't visible anywhere. But I really liked thinking through how the pool would actually operate. Adding the piping helped me visualize how maintenance would manage the habitat, and to me it made the whole thing feel even more believable. Speaking of believability, African penguins would need climate-controlled living quarters, and I wanted to depict that by placing air ducts and a ventilation system in their habitat. This was my first time actually using these pieces the way they are intended to be used, which I thought was pretty cool. I even placed a cooler in the vents, which should keep the living space comfortable for the African penguins. I struggled with the backstage flooring for a while before settling on concrete, but to make it more ethical, I placed primitive rectangles that resembled rubber pads throughout the backstage area. This should be safer for our penguins to walk on. In the backstage area, I also dug out a mini pool for the penguins to swim privately. This was something that the AZA recommended, and I loved the idea of having a more private space where the penguins could swim without prying eyes. I imagine this pool could be a place for keepers to work with the penguins, giving staff and vets a controlled space for checkups. I also wanted our staff to have everything they needed near the habitat, so I placed a few decorations to make the staff area look efficient, then added a keeper hut and a staff room. I'm actually really looking forward to what appears to be fully customizable staff areas in Planet Zoo 2, and I thought I would take some time to practice interior decoration, something I notoriously struggle with. I built a few metal tables and found this really nice fridge in the workshop, which pairs really nicely with the decor in the backstage area. With the interior largely complete, it's time to turn my attention to the exterior of the building. We need to cover up the habitat, the staff area, the water temperature regulator, the water treatment blocks, and the guest viewing area. While there aren't any curves in this building design, that doesn't mean it's going to be easy to make it look good. This section is going to require a lot of custom non-grid pieces, so I'll need to spend some extra time covering everything up and making sure the final build feels polished enough for Gilbert Zoo. While I work on that, I thought I'd give you guys a little update. The coyote pups from last episode have grown up, and I've decided to keep them in the zoo. Coyotes are pack animals that usually live in family groups. While many juvenile coyotes disperse to find their own territory, some offspring stay nearby or remain with their parents longer, often helping raise younger siblings. So keeping the pack together makes a lot of sense to me. Keeping the pack together makes the coyotes happy, which makes me happy. And we love being happy. Back to the penguins. With how large this building is, it needs to look good from every angle because each side will be visible from different areas of the park. I wanted the building to feel like it belongs, no matter where the guests are viewing it from. I started at the back, which is the simplest side of the building. The stone base and stucco-style walls are materials that feel very appropriate for Gilbert, Arizona, so they help the building feel cohesive with the rest of the entrance area rather than out of place. This side of the building includes the staff entrance, and while guests won't be able to access it directly, they may still see it from a distance as they move along the path connecting the African area to the Great State 48 Trail. Because of that, I wanted this side to feel relatively modern and functional, but still blend into the surrounding scenery. To help with that, I added a large planter box which hides some of the imperfections in the terrain and gives me a place to add greenery that softens the building. The tall trellises add vertical detail, break up the wall, and help this side feel less like a major focal point and more like a realistic backdrop. This is the south-facing side of the building, which would realistically see direct sunlight throughout much of the day, so the plant life here would need to be hardy. Moving on to the west-facing side of the building, this is the side closest to the African spurred tortoise habitat. Guests will see this wall pretty frequently as they enter and exit the African section of the Gilbert Zoo. So even though it doesn't need to be a main focal point, it needs to look good. This side of the building doesn't have any guest entrances, so I used trellises to break up the wall vertically and keep it from looking too flat. I also left a large area next to the path untouched because I'm planning to turn that space into a vista point a little later. That means this wall will quite literally serve as the backdrop for an educational experience, so I wanted to make it feel modern and polished, but not overly flashy. The north-facing wall of the African Penguin Conservation Center is one of the first things guests will see when they enter the zoo, so this side needs to feel a bit more welcoming. This is where guests will enter the building to view the penguins, so accessibility and first impressions are really important. I decided to use 3 open arches instead of standard doors because I felt like they made the entrance feel more inviting. I also added ramps alongside the stairs so the building would feel more accommodating for guests who may have a harder time using steps. The open archway approach does create a realism challenge though. In Arizona, an open air entrance would let in a lot of summer heat and allow cooler air conditioning to escape. To help combat that, I placed ventilation near the entrance, and since this is the north-facing side of the building, it would realistically receive much less direct sunlight than the other walls. It's not perfect from an energy efficiency standpoint, but I think it helps the building feel open, welcoming, and believable enough for Gilbert Zoo. With how the building is designed, there are effectively 2 east-facing sections, and they each tell different stories. This first section is the east-facing side of the guest viewing area, and it doesn't need to be flashy. Guests will mostly view the side of the building as they play in the splash pad. I placed rockwork to hide the imperfections in the terrain and to act as a foundation for the guest viewing area. I left this side of the building intentionally simple. A lot but not all of the wall is going to be hidden by taller plants as we build the splash pad. The final wall is a little bit more complicated. As guests travel along the Great State 48 Trail, they'll be in close proximity to this side of the African Penguin Conservation Center. This wall is also right next to the saloon, and having a very modern building directly beside a Western-themed area felt a little jarring and immersion-breaking. So for this section of the building, I decided to create a Western-style false facade to help hide the modern architecture. This is a strategy a lot of theme parks use, where the guest-facing side of a building is designed to support the atmosphere of a specific area, even if the rest of the building serves a completely different purpose. I gave the wooden accents a lighter color to help break up the darker natural tones and make the false facade stand out a little more from the surrounding scenery. Honestly, I was a little worried the false facade would look silly compared to the rest of the modern building. But since this side is really only visible from the Great State 48 Trail, it actually feels right at home from this angle, and I think it does a great job at keeping guests immersed in the atmosphere I'm trying to create. Finally, I moved on to the roof. Since this is Planet Zoo, the camera is constantly flying around the zoo, which means I'm going to see the roof of the African Penguin Conservation Center pretty often. Because of that, I wanted the rooftop to feel realistic and visually interesting instead of looking like one giant square of bland concrete. To break up the surface, I added vents, pipes, and air conditioning units, which also helps reinforce the idea that this is a climate-controlled indoor penguin habitat. I also created a fenced-off service area on the roof, complete with a few potted plants. This helped diversify the rooftop while still keeping the building feeling like something you'd actually see in a real zoo. Aside from minor improvements to the landscaping and interior decorating of the guest viewing area, the African Penguin Conservation Center is complete. Now, it's time to build a splash pad. The vision I had for this splash pad was a rounded shape, so I pulled out our trusty mud column and started rotating pieces to create a cleaner circular layout. As I was building this, I wanted guests to have a reason to actually visit the splash pad. Unfortunately, there isn't really an item in Planet Zoo that guests can interact with like a real splash pad, but I still wanted the area to feel like it would be frequently used by families. To help with that, I placed an ice cream shop at the back side of the saloon and replaced some of the wooden paneling with plaster pieces. From this angle, it makes the building feel a little more modern while still preserving the Western immersion from the Great State 48 Trail. I was really happy with this idea because it helps maximize the space and gives guests another reason to gather in the area. To allow guests to queue for the ice cream shop, I connected the path through the middle of the splash pad circle I built earlier. I also added another path around the outside of the splash pad, giving parents a dry, shaded place to sit and supervise. I didn't love any of the pathing options for the splash pad itself, so I took the time to cover the pathing with painted plaster. That really helped to bring in the color and the smooth surface I was looking for. After that, I added custom fencing along the pathway and filled the surrounding space with mulch and greenery to make the area feel more finished. Finally, it was time to add the water features. Splash pads often have colorful cylindrical arches with water jets, and I felt like rotating the piece and stacking it on top of itself helped create the simple design I was going for. Once I had one arch finished, I copied the group and placed a few more around the splash pad to make the area feel a little more playful. Of course, it wouldn't be a splash pad without water jets erupting from the ground. I thought I came up with a pretty creative way to build these. I aligned a water jet to the center of the concrete square, then used a wooden board almost like a ruler to help create evenly spaced jets in a circular pattern. My friend also had a really good idea to include a mushroom feature in the splash pad with water trickling down from the top while also providing a little shade for the guests. I immediately fell in love with that idea. There are mushroom decorations in the Twilight pack that I could have used, but I ultimately decided that primitive shapes look closer to what I was imagining. The final water feature was probably the simplest to create, but honestly it might be my favorite. I placed down an elephant statue and added a water jet to the trunk, making it look like the elephant is spraying water into the splash pad. This feels right at home in a zoo setting, and I think it was absolutely perfect. And with that, the splash pad is done. I love watching guests walk through this area, even though I wish they reacted to being splashed or had in-game animations where they could actually play in the water. But I digress. I'm really happy with how this turned out. Before we add the penguins to the zoo, I wanted to create a vista point that would help educate guests. I wanted this to feel similar to the educational scenes I created along the Great State 48 Trail, so I started researching African penguins to see if there was anything unique, creative, and meaningful that I could build a scene around. And I think I found the perfect thing. I'm building a ceramic nest. This build made me really excited for custom sizing in Planet Zoo 2. Working with small pieces is really difficult. African penguins are critically endangered, and one of the challenges they face is the loss of safe nesting habitat. In the wild, African penguins historically nested in deep layers of guano, which is essentially built-up seabird droppings. I know, that sounds disgusting, but those guano layers were incredibly important. They allowed penguins to burrow into the ground, helping protect their chicks and eggs from heat, predators, and the elements while also creating a more humid environment for eggs to develop. Unfortunately, humans harvested large amounts of guano to use as fertilizer, which removed much of that natural nesting material from penguin breeding colonies. Without those deep guano layers, many African penguins were left nesting out in the open, where eggs and chicks were much more exposed to the hot sun and other dangers. To help with this, conservationists began developing artificial nest boxes for African penguins. Some early designs helped protect them from predators, but they could also trap too much heat. More recently, ceramic nest boxes have shown a lot of promise because they are designed to mimic natural burrows while staying cooler and maintaining better humidity inside. I decided to build an African penguin ceramic nest display as a vista point because I love that this is such a practical, creative conservation solution, and I wanted to show guests one of the ways people are actively trying to protect these birds in the wild. Using pots from the conservation pack, I created pieces that roughly resembled the shape and size of the ceramic nests, then placed them near the African Penguin Conservation Center. I decorated the area with faux rocks, coastal plant life, and one of our educational signs to make this display feel like a small museum-style exhibit. I really love this simple little build. This build gives guests a unique educational moment, adds more purpose to the area around the African penguin conservation style, and helps connect the habitat back to real-world conservation, which is one of Gilbert Zoo's goals. Now that this small vista point is complete, it's time to decorate the guest viewing area. I placed a display desk at the entrance of the guest viewing area to provide even more educational opportunities about the African penguin. On this desk, I included a penguin statue, a ceramic nest box, and an incubation display to help show Gilbert Zoo's commitment to the welfare and conservation of the African penguin. I'm also planning to include custom images for the conservation education boards, but I haven't had time to edit those in Adobe Illustrator just yet. Now it's finally time to introduce African penguins to Gilbert Zoo. I love this animal so much. What a great addition to Gilbert Zoo. Thank you so much for watching today's video, and I'm sorry this episode was a little late. I recently went camping and wasn't able to finish it in time, but I'm really excited to finally share this one with you. Next week, I think we'll be upgrading the javelina habitat and doing more work on the Great State 48 Trail. Thanks again for watching, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye guys!